Hello, what time is it where you are right now? Type the hour in the comments.
During the engagement speech, in a room filled with soft laughter, clinking glasses, and the delicate sound of a string quartet humming in the background, his sister leaned over, her wine breath brushing against my ear, and whispered, "She's only with him for the money." I remember the taste of the champagne turning metallic on my tongue. I forced a polite smile, even gave a little laugh like she'd just said something absurdly out of place, but then I turned my head ever so slightly and caught Ethan's expression, blank, motionless, utterly indifferent. That was the exact moment something broke. We were standing under a crystal chandelier in the ballroom of his family's Lake Forest estate, surrounded by people I barely knew and never really trusted. The kind of guests who wear old pearls and forced smiles and greet you like you're a stranger even after 6 months of holiday dinners and charity luncheons. My mother was beaming near the dessert table, chatting with Ethan's aunt like they'd known each other for decades, completely unaware of the war erupting in my chest. Rick, my best friend since freshman year at Northwestern, was by the bar mouthing, "You okay?" with that subtle lift of his brow. He knew something was off. He always knew. I was halfway through my thank you speech, holding a glass in one hand, the other lightly resting on Ethan's arm, when Caroline leaned in with her little truth bomb. It was whispered so softly, you might think I'd imagined it, if not for how calculated it was, how practiced her tone sounded. And yet the part that actually hurt the most wasn't her words. It was Ethan. He didn't flinch, didn't defend me, didn't so much as squeeze my hand in solidarity. He just stood there, looking ahead, calm as a statue. And in that stillness, I saw more truth than I'd seen in the past 2 years of dating him. My fingers tightened around the glass, but I didn't cry. I didn't even blink too hard. I just smiled wider, as if Caroline had whispered a compliment instead of an insult. And I kept speaking. I talked about love and gratitude and how lucky I was to be joining a family so welcoming. A few people clapped, someone whistled, and the string quartet picked up the tempo like we just wrapped the scene in a Hallmark special. That's the thing about these events. They're all performance, all polish, no spine. As people began to scatter and the servers floated around with tiny crab cakes and wine refills, I excused myself and walked over to the side table where I'd left my clutch. I could feel my heart beating in my ears, my neck warm with the flush of fury and betrayal. But my hands were steady. I opened the clutch, pulled out the small leather checkbook I always kept on me, an old habit from my early days in real estate when deals sometimes happened over coffee, and flipped to a blank page. Slowly, without a word, I stepped back toward Ethan, Caroline, and the little circle of relatives that had formed around them. They were laughing at something shallow and meaningless, of course. That's the only kind of conversation Caroline ever really engaged in. I stood quietly beside them, waited until a slight pause hit, and then held up the checkbook in one hand, pen in the other. I looked Caroline straight in the eye and asked, "How much did you think I needed?" The air dropped. Every pair of eyes turned toward me, the way you look when someone yells fire in a theater. I didn't raise my voice, didn't change my tone. It wasn't a scene. It was a surgical cut, clean and irreversible. Caroline's mouth twitched, trying to form a response, but no words came. Ethan looked at me, really looked this time, and I saw something flicker, panic maybe, or realization. But again, he didn't speak. He didn't say a damn thing. His silence, once again, louder than anything else in the room. So I turned on my heel, heels clicking like gunshots on marble, and walked out of the ballroom, past the stunned guests, past the awkward smiles and the murmuring waitstaff. I didn't stop to explain. I didn't need to. Anyone paying attention had already heard everything they needed to. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled like lake water and roses. I got into my car, shut the door, and sat there for a moment, my fingers still wrapped around that pen like it was a weapon. I didn't cry. Not yet. What I felt was something deeper, like a pressure valve inside me had just released, and all that careful pretending, all that effort to belong, had finally snapped. The truth is, I've never needed anyone's money. I started from scratch, built my real estate firm from listings no one else wanted, neighborhoods no one believed in. I've made more cold calls, fought through more foreclosure paperwork, and negotiated more impossible deals than Ethan or his entire family ever will. But that night, in that room full of fake smiles and inherited arrogance, they saw me as someone lesser, someone gold-digging her way into old money. And Ethan let them. That's what cut the deepest. I could have caused a scene, thrown a drink, screamed at the top of my lungs, but no, I chose something they'd understand far better: financial power. A woman holding a pen and a checkbook, asking how much it costs to be seen as worthy. As I sat there in my car, headlights catching the shimmer of my engagement ring, I realized I had a choice. I could go back inside and pretend it didn't matter, pretend love would conquer this insult. Or I could do something else, something better. I pulled the ring off slowly, watched it glint in the streetlight, and slipped it into the glove compartment. I started the engine and drove away, past the valet boys, past the manicured hedges, past the version of myself I'd almost become. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew I wasn't done, not by a long shot. It's strange how one sentence can reroute your entire life. That night, after I walked out of the engagement party and left Ethan and his glassy-eyed family standing there with nothing but their secrets and champagne, I found myself sitting in my car, with my checkbook still in my lap, and a cold ache settling into my spine. I hadn't driven anywhere yet. I'd parked just down the hill from the estate, in front of a dimly lit Walgreens that seemed like the least glamorous place in the world to be dressed in heels and silk. But I needed quiet, real quiet. Not the kind you get in marble foyers and manicured gardens, but the kind that comes when everything around you is so painfully ordinary, it reminds you you're still a real person. I hadn't cried, not yet. But the shock had started to peel away, and now I was sitting with the rotten core of it all. It wasn't even Caroline's words. Not really. I'd always known she didn't like me. From the first time we met, there'd been that look, sharp and rehearsed, the one women use when they want you to know you've stepped out of your place. It was the way she said my name, like it was too long for her mouth. The way she brought up Ethan's ex-girlfriends like they were some sort of curated collection he kept behind glass. She was the kind of woman who made compliments sound like insults and made you feel like you owed her something just for breathing the same air. I had ignored it, dismissed it as nerves or jealousy or just the usual sister of the fiancé coldness. But now, hours after her whisper, I was combing through every memory, and it was like turning over rocks and watching the insects scatter. It had been there all along. And worse, Ethan had never once tried to stop it. I called Rick because there was no one else I trusted enough to hold this particular kind of pain. His voice came through with that perfect balance of sarcasm and concern he always had when he sensed I was 2 seconds from emotional combustion. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't have to. Instead, he sighed and said, I was wondering how long it'd take for one of those vultures to finally say it out loud. I told him what Caroline whispered. I told him about the checkbook, the silence, the walkout. He listened, didn't interrupt, and when I paused to breathe, he said something that hit me harder than I expected. He said, You know, Nat, the problem isn't that she said it. The problem is you didn't even seem surprised. I sat with that. Let it simmer because he was right. Deep down, I hadn't been surprised. And that was the saddest part. When I first met Ethan, I fell hard. He was calm in a way that made people lean toward him in crowded rooms. He listened more than he spoke, which I used to think was a sign of depth, not avoidance. He didn't flaunt his wealth like some men I dated before. He never bragged, never corrected the way I said things, never treated my job like a hobby. He was warm, steady, and seemed like someone who wanted a life of balance, something built, not inherited. That was the illusion I bought into, but looking back now, I could see the cracks. There were moments, quiet ones, where I felt like a guest, not a partner. Like when his mother would refer to me as your little real estate girl at dinners, or when his uncle asked me if I'd ever sold a real property before. Ethan always smiled those things away, like brushing dust off a jacket. Never angry, never defensive, just amused. Like their condescension didn't matter because I knew the truth. Except now I wasn't so sure he ever believed the truth about me. Maybe I had just been convenient. And the more I sat in that Walgreens parking lot, the more I started to piece things together. Caroline's timing wasn't random. That whisper during the speech wasn't an impulsive jab. It was a calculated move. Because Caroline wasn't impulsive. She was a strategist. A whisper like that delivered right then, right there, was a test. A test Ethan failed with flying colors. Rick asked if I was going back to talk to him, and I said I didn't know, but I did know. I just didn't want to say it yet. I wasn't going back to beg, to argue, to demand an apology. I'd done that too many times in my life. With boyfriends, with clients, with bosses who smiled too wide and praised me too softly. I'd outgrown the part of myself that begged to be seen. But what I did want, what I needed, was clarity, not about Ethan. I already knew enough about him. I wanted clarity about what I'd missed, what I'd overlooked, and why the hell I'd stayed so long in a place where I had to prove my worth over and over again. When I finally drove home, if you could call it that, considering I hadn't spent a full night there in weeks, I realized how little of Ethan's world actually lived in mine. His things weren't in my apartment. His routines never changed for me. We had been orbiting each other like two polished moons, always close enough to touch, but never really colliding. I unlocked the door to my loft and was struck by how silent it was. No ringtone, no buzzing from my phone. Just quiet, honest, lonely quiet. I poured a glass of wine, sat on the couch still wearing my engagement dress, and stared at the city lights outside my window. And that's when it hit me. I had been performing too, just like they did. I smiled when I was insulted. I laughed at Caroline's fake jokes. I thanked his mother for dinner I couldn't taste through her judgment. I played the part of the grateful girl, like I was lucky to be welcomed in, rather than worthy of belonging on my own merit. But now the curtain had dropped. There was no audience left to impress, and all that was left was the next move. Not the one they expected, not a tearful apology or a meek return. Something else, something deliberate. That night, before I went to bed, I typed a single sentence into the Notes app on my phone. It read, "They think you were after the money. Prove them wrong by showing them what you really want." I didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but I knew it was going to start with me walking back into Ethan's world. Not to return to it, to burn the damn blueprint. The next morning arrived with that particular kind of overcast gray that makes the entire city feel like it's been draped in a wet wool blanket. I hadn't slept more than an hour, my mind doing laps around the same question. If Ethan had really loved me, truly, fully, in the way I thought he had, then how could he have stood there like a mannequin while his sister reduced me to some cliché? It wasn't about defending me in public or making a speech of his own. I didn't need grand gestures. I needed presence. I needed truth. But what I got instead was the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. By mid-morning, I decided I wasn't going to play this out in my head any longer. I got dressed, nothing fancy, just jeans and a cashmere sweater, no makeup, no show, and drove to his condo in Gold Coast, that sleek glass box overlooking the lake that had once felt like a second home. I didn't call ahead. I didn't warn him. I didn't want to give him time to spin a story or hide behind politeness. I wanted to see what happened when there was no script. When he opened the door, he looked like he hadn't slept either. His eyes were puffy, his hair slightly out of place, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked startled to see me. That alone told me something. Ethan Blake was never startled. He was prepared, always, measured, collected, but in that moment, he looked like a man standing on the edge of a ledge, unsure which way he was going to fall. He stepped aside to let me in, but I didn't move. I stood in the doorway and looked at him with a kind of calm I didn't know I had in me. I asked him very clearly and without anger why he hadn't said anything, why he let his sister humiliate me, why he didn't flinch or laugh or do anything when she suggested I was using him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and for a moment I thought he might try to deny it all. But then he sighed, turned his back to me, and walked into the living room like he was too tired to pretend anymore. What came next was not an excuse, not even an apology. It was something worse. He said he didn't want to create a scene at the party, that he thought I'd laugh it off because I always handled Caroline so well. He said he didn't think I needed him to say anything. I just stood there, staring at his back, realizing that his version of love had always been that shallow, a kind of admiration from a distance, a pride in me as a decoration, not a partner. He thought I could take anything, so he gave me nothing. But it wasn't until I asked him directly, point blank, about the trust fund that everything clicked into place. I didn't stumble onto the topic randomly. I remembered Caroline mentioning it once, at a brunch where she'd had one too many mimosas and smirked at Ethan when the check came, teasing, "Better hope she passes the family inspection, or you'll be stuck working for your money." It had sounded like a joke at the time, but now, with the silence from the party still hanging over us like smog, it didn't feel so funny anymore. Ethan hesitated. He looked down at the floor, then he finally told the truth. There was, in fact, a clause in the trust, one his grandfather had written decades ago, that limited access if the beneficiary married someone deemed financially unstable or incompatible with the family's long-term interests. It was outdated, ridiculous, borderline medieval, but it was real. And Ethan, my quiet, steady fiancé, had known about it all along. Worse, he'd never told me. He tried to soften it by saying it didn't matter, that he'd never let that clause dictate his life, that he would have married me anyway. But his voice lacked conviction, and I saw in his eyes the thing he couldn't bring himself to admit. That deep down, he was terrified of losing that money. It wasn't just about love. It never had been. Somewhere in his brain, probably buried under all the polished manners and family expectations, he'd made a calculation. Marrying me would complicate things. Staying silent would delay the damage. And so he chose silence. I asked him why he'd never brought it up, why he never gave me the chance to make that decision for myself. He said he didn't want me to think it mattered. I told him the only thing that mattered was that he assumed it would. That was when I realized we were over. Not because he had a trust fund, not because of Caroline, not even because of the clause. We were over because he saw me as a liability, because when faced with the risk of losing money or losing me, he flinched toward the cash. I left without saying goodbye. He didn't try to stop me. I don't know if that was guilt or relief, but either way, the silence between us now felt complete, total, sealed. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove. I don't even remember where I was going at first, but I ended up in a part of the city I hadn't visited in years. Near the edge of Wicker Park, where I first started selling small properties to struggling artists and single moms trying to get out from under rent they couldn't afford. It was gritty and loud and imperfect, and I suddenly felt more at ease than I had in any lakefront mansion or gated estate. And that's when the idea started to form. It wasn't revenge exactly, not the kind you see in movies. It was something quieter, more surgical, because I didn't want to just walk away. I wanted to walk back into their world and show them what happens when you mistake composure for weakness. I parked in front of an old bakery I recognized, Caroline's passion project, the one she opened last year and used as her small business darling on Instagram. I remembered her bragging about it endlessly, how she saved the place from bankruptcy, how she supported local women-owned businesses. But from what I'd heard through whispers at parties, the bakery wasn't doing well. The books were bleeding, and Caroline's attention span was already drifting. I sat in the car, staring at the building, and something in me clicked into place. I pulled out my phone, opened my contacts, and called my attorney. When he picked up, I didn't hesitate. I said, "I want to buy something, quietly." He asked for details. I gave him the name of a holding company I used for property flips, one that wouldn't be traced back to me easily. Then I gave him the bakery's address. I didn't smile, not yet. But I would. Soon. 2 weeks passed without a word from Ethan, not a text, not a call, not even one of those gutless forwarded articles or half-hearted just checking in messages he used to send when he didn't want to actually say something but needed to feel like he had. It was like he had folded in on himself and vanished back into the gilded cage of his family's estate, probably licking his wounds and telling himself whatever version of the story made him feel like the victim. I didn't care, not anymore. Whatever fantasy he needed to build around my exit wasn't my problem. I was too busy buying his sister's bakery out from under her nose. The sale closed faster than I expected. Turns out, Caroline had signed the lease through a shell company her friend set up, which meant she had no direct ownership, just branding rights and a face on the Instagram account. The actual property had been owned by an old couple who were underwater on taxes and sick of tenant drama. My attorney made a quiet offer through my holding company, clean, above market, no contingencies, and within 8 days the papers were signed, notarized, and filed with the city. Just like that, I owned the building, Caroline's passion project. Her darling little storefront covered in pastel paint and expensive signage, built for brunch selfies and hollow entrepreneurship. Mine now. I didn't say anything. I didn't announce it. I didn't strut down the sidewalk in heels like some movie villain. I simply walked past the bakery on a Tuesday morning with my coffee in hand, paused just long enough to watch Caroline bark at one of her employees over a crooked flower arrangement, and kept moving. She didn't notice me. She wouldn't, not yet. But she would. First, I raised the rent, just a little, nothing outrageous, nothing that would make her pack up immediately, just enough to put her on edge. Then I updated the terms of the lease. Stricter delivery windows, penalties for trash not being properly disposed of, mandatory fire inspections. Every inch of that contract was built like a trap, one she walked into blind because she never bothered to read fine print or follow up on details she assumed were beneath her. Caroline lived in a world where people like me were the help. We existed to solve problems she didn't want to deal with. So when problems started piling up, she did what women like her always do. She panicked behind closed doors and smiled in public. Her Instagram posts became more frantic. First came the overly cheerful captions about supporting local artists, then a giveaway to try and bring in traffic, then a partnership with a local influencer who charged way too much for a one-off coffee promo. I watched it all from a distance, quietly tracking foot traffic, checking Google reviews, listening to employees complain in hushed voices when I dropped by in disguise as a curious customer. I'd sit by the window with my laptop open and a scone I never intended to eat, soaking in every little unraveling thread. And she still didn't know. The thing about revenge is that when done right, it doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't require screaming matches or slashed tires or dramatic confrontations in public. No, the best kind of revenge is subtle. It's elegant. It lets the other person destroy themselves with nothing more than a little push in the right direction and enough rope to hang their own pride. And Caroline had more than enough rope. Meanwhile, my own life was getting lighter. I'd moved some money into an investment account, rebranded a few of my listings to attract a higher-end market, and started hosting real estate workshops for first-time buyers in lower-income neighborhoods. I was rebuilding, not just financially, but mentally, emotionally. I wasn't chasing anyone's approval anymore. I wasn't playing by the old rules, where you pretend to be grateful just for being allowed in the room. I was building my own room. Rick, as usual, knew something was up. We were sitting in my office one afternoon when he said, "You're smiling more lately, but not the way people do when they're happy. It's more like the way villains smile when their plan is working." I told him he wasn't wrong. He leaned back in his chair, popped a mint into his mouth, and asked if I wanted to tell him what I'd done. I looked at him and said, "Not yet. You'll know when it's done." It wasn't long after that when Ethan finally reached out. A single delivery, no card, just a box. Inside was the same bouquet his mother always ordered for her fundraisers. White roses and green hydrangeas, wrapped in cream paper, tied with a ribbon so stiff it looked like it had been ironed. Tucked underneath was a note, handwritten, in the same steady script I used to love. I was a coward. I miss you. I never stopped. That was it. I stared at that note for a long time, not because I missed him, I didn't, but because I couldn't believe how little he still understood. He thought the damage was about emotions, about love, about hurt feelings. But it wasn't. It was about something far more sacred, trust. And once broken, trust doesn't get patched up with flowers and apologies that arrive too late. It doesn't care if your hands are shaking or your eyes are red, or if your sister whispered something cruel and you just didn't know what to say. Trust is a currency, and Ethan had spent every last cent of it. So I returned the bouquet, personally. I walked into the lobby of his office building, handed it to the receptionist, and asked her to make sure Mr. Blake received it. Inside the box, I slipped a single document, clean, white paper with the deed to the bakery, folded neatly between the petals. No note, no explanation. Just ownership, printed in black and white, proof of exactly what I'd done and exactly how far I was willing to go when someone mistook me for weak. Later that night, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. When I finally listened, it was Ethan. His voice sounded hoarse, like he'd been shouting or crying, or both. He said, "I didn't think you'd do something like this. I didn't think you were that kind of person." I played the message again and again. Then I laughed, a real, deep laugh. Because that was the point, wasn't it? He didn't think I was that kind of person. Because people like Caroline and Ethan never see women like me as dangerous. They see us as placeholders, as seat fillers at their banquet tables. Until we build our own damn table, send them an invitation, and watch them squirm over which fork to use. I didn't call him back. Instead, I poured myself a drink, opened my laptop, and pulled up the floor plans for a new commercial property I was eyeing. A lot just 2 blocks down from the bakery, perfect for a cafe or a co-working space. Something built on purpose, not privilege. And as I stared at the plans, I thought, your silence cost more than you thought, Ethan, and I'm not even done collecting. The final time I saw Ethan, the sky was overcast in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if even the weather had decided to match the tone of something that needed no brightness, no warmth, no dramatic send-off, just a quiet grayness to act as a mirror. He had asked to meet one last time, and against my better judgment, I agreed, not out of sentiment or curiosity, but because I wanted to look him in the eye and confirm, without the distortion of memory or the fog of emotion, that the man I once loved truly did not exist, in the way I had believed he did. We met at a small cafe on the near north side, the kind of place we would have never chosen back when we were still pretending to want the same things. It was tucked between a yoga studio and a used bookstore, with mismatched chairs and a cracked tile floor that reminded me of my first apartment. I arrived early because I wanted to choose the seat with the better view of the door, not for strategy, but simply because I knew that if he hesitated before walking in, I needed to see it. I needed to see if his guilt would make him pause, if his shame had finally grown teeth. He arrived right on time, not a second early or late, like always. That used to comfort me, his precision, his reliability, but now it just struck me as clinical. He wore a gray coat over a navy sweater, and his hair was styled like it always had been. Conservative, clean, a man so polished he could vanish into any corporate boardroom or country club without a ripple. He sat across from me with a quiet sigh, like this meeting was some final chapter in a tragedy he still couldn't quite believe had happened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I stirred my tea even though I wasn't going to drink it, and he looked around the cafe like he was trying to memorize the unremarkable details of a place he'd never think about again. When he finally did speak, his voice was softer than I remembered. Not gentle, but careful, the way someone sounds when they've rehearsed a speech in their head, but know it probably won't land the way they want it to. He said he had been thinking a lot. He said he regretted not standing up for me. He said Caroline was cruel, and that he should have told her to stop, that he should have defended me, that he should have told me everything about the trust clause the moment he realized how much it was starting to shape his decisions. He said he was scared, not of losing money, but of losing the version of himself he thought he was supposed to be. That part almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully predictable. He was afraid of disappointing the version of Ethan Blake that his family had built for him. And so he stayed silent and expected me to be strong enough to carry the weight of that silence without ever asking why it was being placed on my shoulders in the first place. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod in sympathy or offer soft reassurances. I let him speak because I wasn't there to argue. I was there to make sure he understood the damage wasn't just personal, it was structural. It was about what happens when a man with power chooses comfort over courage. When someone who claims to love you allows a room full of vultures to circle and waits for you to save yourself while he quietly turns away. When he finished talking, I reached into my purse, the same one I had brought to the engagement party, and pulled out my checkbook. The leather cover was worn in now, the corners slightly curled, the paper inside thinned from use. I opened it slowly, methodically, and without a hint of anger in my voice, I said, "You know, just for fun, what do you think I needed?" He blinked, confused. I could see him searching for the meaning, the reference, probably trying to recall every time I had ever mentioned money or success or ambition, trying to determine how this fit into the story he was trying to rewrite. I slid the checkbook across the table with the pen laid neatly on top and said, "Go ahead, write it down, put a number. Any number you think I would have needed badly enough to lie, to scheme, to play along while your sister dissected me like I was a gold-digging parasite who couldn't possibly love a man without his wallet attached." He didn't touch it. He just stared at the paper like it had turned into a live wire, and for a long stretch of seconds, he said absolutely nothing. The silence was dense, but this time it wasn't mine to carry. It was his. Finally, I reached over, picked up the checkbook, and tore out the blank page. I folded it once, neatly, and placed it in front of him. Then I stood, adjusted my coat, and said something that had been forming in my head since that night I walked out of the engagement party, with my heels echoing behind me. Twice now you chose silence when words would have mattered most. And that's 2 more times than I forgive. I left him sitting there, alone with a blank check and the weight of a truth he would never quite be able to bury. I didn't turn around. I didn't look back to see if he watched me go. Some exits deserve to be permanent. A week later, I signed the lease on a new space, an open, sunlit commercial building with exposed brick and high ceilings. It had good bones and terrible wiring, the kind of project that would take sweat and patience and creativity. I loved it immediately. It was mine. No borrowed status, no strings, no nameplates I had to smile politely at. Rick walked through it with me the first day and asked, "So what are you going to build here?" I looked around, inhaled the dust and potential, and said, "Something no one can take from me." It wasn't about property anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about reclamation, about building a world that didn't need the approval of the Blakes or their quiet, inherited expectations. A world where I wasn't a guest, or a threat, or a project, but the damn architect. I kept that torn-out blank check. I didn't shred it or burn it or frame it for theatrics. I kept it folded in the back of my desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Not of him, of me, of the moment I realized I didn't need to prove anything. Not to Ethan, not to Caroline, not to anyone who thought I came with a price tag. They saw me as someone who wanted to marry into wealth. What they never understood was that I was never trying to marry into anything. I was building my own empire, quietly, deliberately, and they never saw it coming.